What happens when the people trained to protect lives become the ones accused of taking them? How does a decorated soldier end up strapped to a gurney instead of standing at a podium? Were they truly guilty, or did the uniform hide something the system refused to see? And why, decades later, are these cases still tearing the military justice system apart? In today's video, we're diving into 5 of the most disturbing military death row cases, including Army Specialist Ronald Gray, Army Officer Hassan Akbar, Major Nidal Hassan, Master Sergeant Timothy Hennis, and Green Beret Jeffrey McDonald. Each story is different. Each case is darker than the last. Before we get into it, make sure you hit subscribe, because these are stories you won't hear anywhere else. Stay to the end, because the last case on this list might be the most disturbing miscarriage of justice in modern military history. Case 1. Jeffrey McDonald. He had everything: a brilliant mind, a beautiful wife, 2 perfect daughters, and a son on the way. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a Green Beret. But in the dead of night, he called for help, whispering into the phone, "Stabbing, help, 544 Castle Drive." When authorities arrived, they walked into a scene out of a horror film. His pregnant wife was butchered, his children stabbed and beaten beyond recognition, and above the bed, in blood-red letters, one word: pig. He claimed a drug-crazed cult broke in, chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." But the blood, the fibers, the silence of the night told a different story. This is the twisted, tangled tale of Jeffrey McDonald, the man who became the center of one of the most litigated murder cases in American history. Jeffrey McDonald was what every parent wanted their son to be. Student council president, prom king, voted most popular and most likely to succeed. Sharp, confident, charismatic. The kind of guy people didn't just admire, they followed. A full scholarship to Princeton, a medical degree from Northwestern. And then, he did something almost nobody expected. He volunteered for the elite special forces, the Green Berets. On paper, he was unstoppable. A doctor, a soldier, a family man. But what no one could see was how deeply those 3 roles would clash, and what would happen when the pressure finally cracked the surface. The McDonalds were stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, living on Castle Drive. Neighbors described Jeffrey and Colette as friendly, attractive, even enviable. They were expecting their 3rd child, a son. To the outside world, they were the American dream: wholesome, disciplined, untouchable. But Colette wasn't as at peace as the neighbors believed. In letters to old college friends, she described her life as normal and happy, but between the lines, something else showed through. She had dreams of finishing college, of becoming an English teacher, dreams she quietly set aside to stay home with the kids. She wrote that their baby boy was due in July, that the family would soon be complete. But friends noticed she seemed increasingly reserved, sometimes overwhelmed. There were whispers of arguments behind closed doors. And there was Jeff's other life. At the hospital, he was known to be charming, flirtatious, known to have affairs. Colette may not have known every detail, but she wasn't blind. She was 26 years old, a mother of 2, almost a third, quietly carrying a marriage that was fraying while the world outside still saw a fairy tale. It was 3:42 a.m., February 17, 1970. A chilling call came into the Fort Bragg dispatch. "Help, 544 Castle Drive. Stabbing, hurry." Military police found the front door locked, the house dark. But around back, the screen door was open. Inside, Colette lay dead on the bedroom floor, stabbed 37 times. Her trachea slashed, a pajama top draped across her chest, the word pig written in blood on the headboard. 5-year-old Kimberly, bludgeoned and stabbed in the neck so violently her cheekbone broke through the skin. 2-year-old Kristen, stabbed 48 times, 2 wounds piercing her tiny heart. McDonald was found alive, whispering, "Check my kids. I heard my kids crying." His injuries? A collapsed lung, a few cuts, some bruises. He walked out of the hospital 9 days later. His story: 4 intruders, 3 men, and a woman with a candle, chanting about killing pigs. He fought back, he said, using his pajama top to block an ice pick. before they overpowered him. If you were on that jury, staring at a war hero with a collapsed lung and cuts on his chest, would you have believed him too? Because investigators didn't. The living room he claimed to have fought in was barely disturbed. A coffee table had tipped, but landed neatly on a stack of magazines. His pajama fibers, supposedly torn off during the attack, weren't found in the living room at all. They were found under Colette's body, in Kimberly's room, under Kristen's fingernail. The murder weapons all came from inside the house. There was no forced entry. Forensic analysts recreated the crime scene and discovered all 48 stab holes in that pajama top could only have been made while the shirt was stationary, laid over Colette's body after she was already dead, not torn apart in a struggle. The story was crumbling, and behind the story, they began to see the man. For a while, he walked free. An army hearing dropped the charges. He moved to California, started over, even went on television joking about the case, calling the investigation a joke. And for one man watching that interview, it was the final straw. Alfred Kassab, Colette's stepfather, had stood by MacDonald from the beginning. But something in that flippant, cold tone made him request the full trial transcript. What he read turned his stomach. He spent years afterward contacting Congress, the DOJ, the media, refusing to let it go. Before we get into the courtroom bombshell that took Kassab from supporter to prosecutor's best witness, hit subscribe. This case takes 3 trials to close. In 1979, 9 years after the murders, a civilian jury found MacDonald guilty of second-degree murder for Colette and Kimberly and first-degree murder for Kristen, 3 consecutive life sentences. He fought the verdict for decades. New evidence surfaced. A woman named Helena Stokely confessed, then recanted, over and over. DNA testing in the 2000s found no intruder's DNA at the scene at all, just MacDonald's. Today, Jeffrey MacDonald is in his 80s, still behind bars, still claiming innocence. Do you believe MacDonald, or was the blood telling the truth all along? MacDonald hid behind a war hero's uniform to get away with murder for years, but at least the U.S. Army eventually caught up with him. The next man on this list didn't need to hide at all. The military handed him the perfect hunting ground, and nobody stopped him for over a year. Case 2, Ronald Gray. The next man on this list didn't need to hide at all. The military handed him the perfect hunting ground, and for months, nobody stopped him. Ronald Adrian Gray didn't look like a killer. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't decorated. He wasn't the kind of soldier people noticed when he entered a room. He was an Army cook stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Quiet, distant, easy to overlook. A ghost in the unit. But outside the base, young women were being stalked, attacked, raped, and in some cases, murdered. At first, the attacks seemed disconnected. A woman walking home alone, another near a parking lot, someone vulnerable, someone isolated. But the pattern was there. The attacker knew how to choose his victims. He knew how to overpower them, and he knew the military landscape around Fort Bragg well enough to disappear into it. By April 1986, Gray had already begun escalating. The violence wasn't impulsive. It was methodical. He watched. He waited. And when the moment was right, he attacked. Then came Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay. Laura was only 18 years old, young, bright, full of potential. A soldier at Fort Bragg, just beginning her adult life. On December 15, 1986, she disappeared. Weeks later, her body was found in the woods on the installation. Prosecutors said she had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Think about that for a second. A young woman joins the military, an institution built on discipline, protection, and duty, and ends up dead on the very ground where she was supposed to be safe. But even then, the danger was not fully stopped. The cases piled up. Survivors described a predator. Investigators kept looking, and all around Fort Bragg, fear was growing. Yet the military had its own reputation to protect. The idea that a soldier could be hunting women in and around the base was not just a criminal problem, it was an institutional embarrassment. And when institutions worry more about appearances than people, predators get time. Gray got more time. On January 6, 1987, he called for a cab. The driver who arrived was Kimberly Ann Ruggles, a 24-year-old civilian. She had no reason to think the passenger entering her vehicle would become the last person she ever picked up. Hours later, Kimberly was dead. But this time, Gray made a mistake. Evidence linked him to her cab. Investigators found him with property connected to the crime. And as police closed in, the quiet army cook who had blended into the background suddenly had nowhere left to run. The investigation opened wider. A military court later convicted Gray of the murders of Private Laura Vickery Clay and Kimberly Ruggles, as well as the attempted murder of another woman, Mary Ann Lang Namath, and multiple rapes, robberies, and other offenses. How many women had to die before the uniform stopped being a shield and started being a red flag? If you think the military should have acted faster, hit that like button so this story reaches more people. In 1988, a court-martial panel at Fort Bragg sentenced Ronald Gray to death. But the legal story didn't end there. In July 2008, President George W. Bush approved Gray's death sentence, a rare presidential approval in a military capital case. The Army set an execution date for December 10, 2008. Then, just weeks before it was supposed to happen, a federal court issued a stay. And after that, more motions, more appeals, more years. For the families of Laura Lee Vickery Clay, Kimberly Ruggles, and the women who survived, every delay became another reminder that even a death sentence does not always mean an ending. Ronald Gray remains one of the longest-serving inmates on military death row. Is Ronald Gray being protected by a broken system, or is this just what due process looks like at the highest levels? Gray's crimes were driven by pure predation, no ideology, no politics, just violence. But the next case forces a harder question. What happens when the why behind the killing is belief itself, not appetite? Here's something that connects every name on this list, and it's the part the Army never wants you to notice. Every single one of these men showed warning signs, in writing, on record, years before anyone died. Keep watching, because the next case has a paper trail so damning, investigators later called it preventable. Case 3, Hassan Akbar. Imagine being deep in the Kuwaiti desert, days away from war. You're surrounded by fellow soldiers. Men you trained with, trusted, ate with, laughed with. The night is still, the air is tense, but hopeful. Tomorrow, you may cross into Iraq. Then, boom, a grenade explodes. Screams pierce the darkness. Another explosion, then gunfire. And when the smoke clears, the unthinkable becomes reality. The enemy wasn't outside the fence. He was in the tent right next to you. This is the story of Hassan Akbar, the U.S. soldier who turned on his own. And what pushed him to commit one of the most shocking betrayals in modern military history? Before he was Hassan Akbar, before he was locked inside the United States disciplinary barracks, he was Mark Fidel Cools. He was born in Los Angeles in 1971. His father had a rough past, gang life, prison time. But while he was behind bars, he found Islam. When he got out, he changed his name to Akbar. Mark's mother followed, and when she remarried another Muslim convert, her son was given a new identity, Hassan Karim Akbar. Raised in a rough neighborhood, Hassan stood out. Not because he was violent, not because he was a troublemaker, but because he was smart. In 1988, he got into UC Davis. He studied aeronautical and mechanical engineering. It should have been the beginning of a perfect life. But it wasn't. It took him 9 years to finish college. He kept stopping, starting, dropping out, re-enrolling. And when he finally graduated with 2 engineering degrees, he did not walk into a dream job. He walked into debt, deep debt. So he joined the Army, but not as an officer, like many engineering graduates. He enlisted. And almost immediately, things began to fall apart. Assigned to the 326th Engineer Battalion with the 101st Airborne Division, Akbar became isolated. His superiors saw him as strange, unreliable, difficult to work with. He was demoted from a leadership role and pushed into basic tasks. Other soldiers avoided him. He kept to himself. Sometimes he mumbled under his breath. He was there, but he was invisible. By early 2003, the unit was at Camp Pennsylvania in northern Kuwait, preparing for the invasion of Iraq, and according to the evidence later presented in court, Akbar had already begun writing down thoughts that should have terrified anyone who read them. "I suppose they want to punk me or just humiliate me," he wrote. "They are right, but as soon as I am in Iraq, I am going to try and kill as many of them as possible." Let that sink in. This wasn't a sudden breakdown. This wasn't a split-second loss of control. This was written down, personal, cold, planned. On the night of March 22nd, heading into the early morning of March 23rd, Akbar allegedly stole grenades, cut power to the generator lighting the camp, and waited until soldiers and officers were asleep or preparing for bed. Then he threw grenades into tents and opened fire with his M4 rifle. The attack killed 2 men. Captain Christopher Seifert was 27 years old. He was shot in the back. Major Gregory Stone was 40, a husband, a father. He died after suffering 83 shrapnel wounds. 14 other service members were wounded. These weren't strangers on a battlefield. They were men sleeping beside someone they believed was one of them. Was this about religion, about racism, or was something deeper eating him alive? News of the attack spread fast. Soldiers were preparing for war against an enemy across the border. But this time, the threat had come from inside their own camp. At Akbar's court-martial in 2005, his defense did not deny that he carried out the attack. Instead, they argued he had long struggled with mental illness, paranoia, isolation, delusional thinking, and instability. But prosecutors pointed to the journal entries, the stolen grenades, the generator he shut down, the officers he targeted. To them, it wasn't illness alone, it was premeditation. Then, during the trial, Akbar shocked the courtroom again. Prosecutors said he smuggled out a sharp piece of metal, waited for a military police officer to remove his cuffs, and stabbed the guard in the neck and shoulder before another officer restrained him. And still, the central question remained. Was Hassan Akbar a man consumed by ideology, or a broken soldier the army failed long before he ever stepped into that desert? On April 21, 2005, a military jury found him guilty of 2 counts of premeditated murder and 3 counts of attempted premeditated murder. 1 week later, the panel sentenced him to death. His appeals moved through the military justice system for years. In 2015, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces upheld the conviction and sentence. In 2016, the Supreme Court declined to hear his case. If you've made it this far, you know how complex this case is. Share this video. It's one everyone should know about. Today, Hassan Akbar remains on military death row. Should Akbar be executed, or was he a soldier failed by the system? Akbar's warning signs were personal, buried in a private journal. The next man's warning signs were public, delivered in slideshows, emails, and presentations. And the FBI read every one of them. Case 4. Nidal Hassan. He was trained to build bridges. He was trained to save lives. He was a doctor, a psychiatrist, a man trusted with soldiers who came home from war carrying wounds nobody else could see. But on a calm November morning in Texas, Major Nidal Hassan walked into a room full of American soldiers and unleashed hell. 13 people were killed. More than 30 others were wounded. And the question that still haunts the military is not just why he did it. It's how many people saw the warning signs before he did. Nidal Malik Hassan was born in Arlington, Virginia in 1970 to Palestinian immigrant parents. From the outside, his story looked like the American dream in uniform. He was intelligent, educated, ambitious. He studied biochemistry at Virginia Tech, then joined the United States Army, and went on to medical school through the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. He became a psychiatrist, the kind of doctor soldiers were supposed to trust with their fears, their trauma, their thoughts of suicide, the things they could not say to their commanders or families. But behind the rank and the white coat, things were falling apart. At Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where Hassan trained as a resident, people began noticing red flags. He struggled academically. He took 6 years to complete a program designed for 4. Supervisors described poor judgment and unprofessional behavior. Some colleagues were disturbed by his religiously charged presentations and worried about his mental state. But the Army was stretched thin. It needed psychiatrists. Hassan had qualifications. So he kept moving forward. He was counseled. He was monitored. And still, he was promoted. During one presentation at Walter Reed, Hassan delivered a PowerPoint called The Quranic Worldview as it Relates to Muslims in the U.S. Military. It was supposed to be an academic presentation, but to the people watching, it felt like something else. Hassan argued that Muslim service members should be allowed to leave the military as conscientious objectors rather than be deployed against other Muslims. He warned that forcing them into combat could lead to what he called adverse events. And when people asked what that meant, the answer was chilling. Refusing to deploy, espionage, killing fellow soldiers. Think about that. A military psychiatrist stood in front of his colleagues and described the possibility of Muslim soldiers turning their weapons on their own people. Months later, that is exactly what he would do. Can you spot a killer before they act, or are we always one step too late? But the warnings did not stop there. In late 2008 and 2009, Hassan began sending emails to Anwar al-Awlaki, a radical cleric who would later become one of the most influential voices in extremist propaganda. The FBI intercepted the communications. Federal agents knew Hassan was an army psychiatrist. They knew he had exchanged messages with al-Awlaki, but the FBI concluded that Hassan's emails appeared connected to authorized professional research. No emergency warning was sent to the Army. No serious intervention stopped him. Later investigations would argue that agencies had enough information to detect Hassan's radicalization toward violent extremism, even if they did not know the exact date, place, or method of an attack. The tragedy was not that nobody noticed. The tragedy was that too many people noticed pieces of it, and no one put the pieces together in time. By 2009, Hassan had been transferred to Fort Hood, Texas. He had received orders to deploy to Afghanistan. In the days before the attack, he reportedly gave away possessions and prepared as if he would not be coming back. Then came November 5th. The Soldier Readiness Center at Fort Hood was full of people processing paperwork before deployment. Soldiers, civilians, families. People waiting for medical appointments. Some were preparing to leave for war. Others had only just returned from it. One soldier had come home from Iraq. Another victim was pregnant. They were not in a combat zone. They were not behind enemy lines. They were on an American military base, standing inside a building that should have been safe. Then Hassan walked in armed with a FN-57 pistol and a .357 revolver. Witnesses said he shouted, "Allahu Akbar," then opened fire. The room became chaos. People ducked beneath tables. Others ran for the exits. Some froze. They could not understand what they were seeing, because the shooter was not a stranger. He was Major Hassan, a doctor, a fellow soldier, someone trained to treat trauma, now creating it. For minutes, he moved through the building firing at soldiers and civilians. 13 people were killed. 32 others were wounded. The attack only ended after police officers Kimberly Munley and Mark Todd confronted him. Munley was shot multiple times. Todd fired back, striking Hassan and leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. The man who had walked into Fort Hood to kill was still alive. And he would soon face a military court. If you're still watching, make sure you subscribe. You won't believe what happens next. Most defendants fight for their freedom. Hassan did not. At his 2013 court-martial, he represented himself. He did not mount the kind of defense people expected. He did not try to convince the jury he was innocent. He did not challenge the mountain of eyewitness testimony, ballistic evidence, and forensic proof against him. Instead, he admitted he was the shooter. He said he had switched sides. He called himself a mujahideen. His court-appointed lawyers warned that Hassan appeared to be steering himself toward a death sentence. But he kept control of his own defense. He declined to cross-examine many witnesses. He called no meaningful defense witnesses. He gave the prosecution almost nothing to fight against. For victims' families, the trial was not about discovering who did it. It was about facing the man who had destroyed their lives. Over 11 days, survivors testified. Some cried. Some described playing dead. Some spoke about friends, spouses, and children whose lives ended in a place that was supposed to prepare them for deployment, not death. On August 23, 2013, a military panel convicted Nidal Hassan of 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder. 5 days later, the same panel sentenced him to death and dismissed him from the army. But even from death row, Hassan did not express remorse. In 2014, he wrote to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS at the time, asking to become a citizen of the so-called Islamic State. In the letter, he described it as an honor to serve as an obedient citizen soldier. No apology, no regret. No sign that the ideology behind the attack had disappeared. After Fort Hood, a Senate investigation delivered a conclusion that cut deeper than any courtroom verdict. The government agencies involved had enough information to have detected Hassan's violent radicalization, but failed to do so. The report described Fort Hood as the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil since September 11, 2001. And in the painful days after the massacre, Army Chief of Staff General George Casey drew outrage when he warned that it would be an even greater tragedy if diversity became a casualty of the event. For many grieving families, that statement felt impossible to hear. 13 people were dead, 32 people were wounded, and the institution that had missed the signs was already debating what it could not afford to lose. Today, Nidal Hassan remains on military death row. He wanted to be remembered as a martyr. Instead, he became a warning about ignored reports, missed connections. Institutions that see danger in fragments but fail to recognize the whole picture until it is too late. Hassan and Akbar were both stopped only after the damage was done. But one man on this list was convicted, cleared, and convicted again for the very same crime. And it is the strangest legal story in this entire list. Case 5, Timothy Hennis. What if you were sentenced to death, only to be completely cleared? What if you walked out of prison, returned to your family, went back into the army, built a new life? And then, more than 20 years later, the military came back for you. Not for a new crime, for the exact same one. This is the story of Timothy Hennis, a man caught between life and death, guilt and innocence, freedom and a justice system that refused to let go. It begins in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in May 1985. Captain Gary Eastburn was away on military training. At home were his wife, Catherine, known as Katie, and their 3 little daughters, 5-year-old Kara, 3-year-old Erin, and baby Jana, not yet 2. They were preparing to move to England, where Gary had received a new Air Force assignment. And like so many families getting ready for a major move, Katie had 100 small problems to solve. One of them was their dog. The family had an English setter named Dixie. Katie placed a classified ad offering the dog to a good home. It seemed harmless, a simple ad, a small favor for a family pet. But one of the people who answered it was an Army sergeant named Timothy Hennis. Hennis came to the Eastburn home on May 7th. He spoke with Katie. He took Dixie. Then he left. According to Hennis, that was the last time he ever saw her. A few days later, Katie stopped answering calls. Gary could not reach his family. Concern grew. And on May 12th, a neighbor entered the Eastburn home with a police officer. What they found inside was beyond disturbing. Katie Eastburn had been sexually assaulted and stabbed repeatedly in her bedroom. Her daughters, Kara and Erin, had been murdered too. And Jana, the youngest child, was still alive. She had been alone inside that house for days. Alone with her mother and sisters. Dehydrated, covered in waste. Too young to understand why nobody was coming. Just think about that. A baby surviving in silence, in a home where her entire world had been destroyed around her. The murders shocked Fayetteville. A military family had been wiped out in what should have been the safety of their own home. There was no obvious forced entry, no clear motive, no immediate answer. But investigators began following the dog ad. Timothy Hennis soon became a major suspect. He matched parts of an eyewitness description. A witness claimed to have seen a man leaving the Eastburn driveway carrying a large plastic bag. Another witness connected a man matching Hennis's appearance to an ATM near the time Katie's card was used after her death. Hennis had financial problems. He had reportedly been behind on rent and had written bad checks. Investigators also focused on a dark jacket he had taken to a dry cleaner shortly after the murders, and allegations that he had burned items behind his home. Piece by piece, the case against him grew. In 1986, Timothy Hennis went to trial. Prosecutors argued that he had returned to the house after collecting the dog, attacked Katie, then murdered her daughters to eliminate witnesses. The jury believed them. Hennis was convicted of the rape and murders of Katie, Kara, and Erin Eastburn. He was sentenced to death. Then, on the same day the verdict came down, an anonymous letter arrived. "Dear Mr. Hennis," it said, "I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time." It was signed only Mr. X. No return address, no proof, no fingerprints, nothing to show that it was real. To the public, it sounded like a hoax. To Hennis, it looked like a message from the real killer. But the case was far from over. Hennis appealed. His lawyers argued that graphic crime scene photographs had unfairly prejudiced the original jury. The North Carolina Supreme Court overturned his conviction and ordered a new trial. This time, the defense attacked the evidence. They challenged eyewitness descriptions. They pointed out inconsistencies. They raised questions about the timeline, the ATM witness, and physical evidence that did not appear to match Hennis. And in 1989, after a second trial, the jury found Timothy Hennis not guilty. He walked free. He returned to active duty in the Army. He served for years after that. He eventually retired honorably in 2004 as a master sergeant. For Hennis, it may have felt like the nightmare had finally ended, but for the Eastburn family, it never could. Katie was gone. Kara was gone. Erin was gone. And baby Jana had grown up carrying the legacy of one of the most brutal crimes in North Carolina history. Then science changed everything. In 2006, investigators retested biological evidence taken from Katie Eastburn's body using DNA technology that did not exist in the 1980s. Prosecutors said the results linked Timothy Hennis to the crime scene. And suddenly, the Army had a problem. Hennis had already been acquitted by North Carolina. Under normal circumstances, double jeopardy means the government cannot simply try you again because it dislikes the verdict. Once you are acquitted, the state does not get to keep rolling the dice until it gets the result it wants. But Hennis was not just a civilian. He had been a soldier when the murders happened. The Army argued that it had separate authority to prosecute him under military law. Even though North Carolina had already tried and acquitted him, the military was treated as a different sovereign for jurisdictional purposes. So the army recalled the retired Hennis to active duty. Not to serve, to stand trial again. Had the system corrected a historic wrong or created a new one? Share this video with someone who thinks the justice system always works. In 2010, Timothy Hennis returned to Fort Bragg, the same military community connected to the murders decades earlier, for a third trial. This time, the prosecution had DNA, not eyewitness memory, not a sketch. Not a theory built around an ATM card or a dry-cleaned jacket. DNA. After weeks of testimony, a military panel found Hennis guilty of 3 counts of premeditated murder. He was sentenced to death again. The conviction set off a legal argument that has never fully gone away. Some people saw the new DNA result and believed justice had finally caught up to a killer who slipped through the cracks. Others saw something more troubling: a man convicted, then acquitted, then pulled back into the system by a different branch of government and condemned again for the same crime. The courts ultimately upheld the Army's authority to recall and court-martial Hennis, concluding that the military had jurisdiction despite the earlier state acquittal. Today, Timothy Hennis remains on military death row at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. No execution date has been set, and his story still forces an impossible question. If he was guilty, the system let a murderer walk free for more than 20 years. But if the system can keep trying someone until it gets a conviction, what does an acquittal really mean? Sometimes justice takes the long road, and sometimes it just keeps circling back. 5 men, 5 uniforms, 5 different crimes. Jeffrey McDonald, Ronald Gray, Hassan Akbar, Nidal Hassan, Timothy Hennis, a doctor accused of destroying the family he was supposed to protect. A quiet army cook who turned military ground into a hunting ground. A soldier who brought grenades into the tents of men who trusted him. A military psychiatrist who gave warning signs in public before turning his weapon on his own people. And a man sentenced to die, cleared, then dragged back into court decades later for the same nightmare. But beneath every crime, every trial, every death sentence, there is one uncomfortable thread. The system saw something. A red flag. A report. A strange behavior. A warning in writing. A piece of evidence that did not fit. And every single time, it wasn't enough. For the victims and families left behind, there are no clean endings. No verdict can erase the fear. No sentence can bring back a mother, a child, a soldier, or a life that was taken too soon. So what do you think? Were these men failed by the system before they committed their crimes? Or did the system fail only after it was already too late? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe to Craziest Tuesday Crimes for more true crime stories the mainstream won't touch. And turn on notifications, because the next episode might be even darker than this one.